Welcome, everybody. It's a great privilege for me to be here in the tent and to be here with, of course, Madeleine Albright and Hernando De Soto. I'm Andrea Mitchell from NBC News, and it is a treat for me today. I've spent a lot of time over the years following Madeleine Albright around the world, and it is very hard to keep up with her. But this is one of her latest ventures, a joint venture with Hernando De Soto, and venturing into a completely different realm for her, and it just shows the breadth of her knowledge and the range of her curiosity about the human condition. Hernando De Soto, president of the Institute for Liberty and Democracy, which is a think tank headquartered in his native Peru, former governor of Peru's central bank, innovative thinker, groundbreaking thinker about global development, the author of two big books, most notably an extraordinary book, The Mystery of Capital, Why Capitalism Triumphs in the West and Fails Everywhere Else, winner of so many prizes, the Adam Smith Award, the Templeton Freedom Prize, the Milton Freedom Prize for Advancing Liberty, the Bradley Prize. And importantly here today, co-chair of this UN Commission on Legal Empowerment of the Poor with Madeleine Albright. Madeleine Albright, the principal of the Albright-Stonebridge Group in Washington, 64th Secretary of State, the first woman to be Secretary of State, former UN ambassador. You know her history, major figure here at Aspen for many years, and the source of great pride to all authors everywhere, the serial bestseller of so many books. Madeleine Albright has proved that she has a vast following around the world for everything that she writes. But Madeleine, Madam Secretary, the most interesting thing to me is what brought you two together, because frankly, you're an unlikely couple, and I think I know something about unlikely couples. So tell us the story of how the two of you met.
Well, I wish I had a romantic involvement with her.
You never know what can happen in Aspen. What happens in Aspen stays in Aspen.
Anyway, I have to tell you how we did meet, because I had read The Mystery of Capitalism. I thought it was just a brilliant book that truly explained so much about what was going on. At that time, shortly after I left office, I was doing some things at the University of Michigan Davidson Institute on Emerging Markets and Democracies, and I had to put together several seminars, and I invited Dr. De Soto to come and be a part of them. And I was bowled over by his knowledge and his capability of explaining things in language that people could understand, and his path-breaking work on how to work with the poor or help the poor. And then he asked me to come and co-chair this commission, which was under the auspices of the UNDP, UN Development Program, that we then co-chaired for 3 years on the basis of his idea about property rights and access to justice for poor people. And it was a remarkable commission. We had 4 former presidents on it, and a former chairman of the WTO, and a number of people, assorted foreign and finance ministers, and we came out with this report, and I learned a great deal, and I think we really had created a template for how to deal with what I consider the greatest negative part of globalization, the growing gap between the rich and the poor.
And it is more relevant now than ever. We're at a point in this global recession where we so often focus on the effects here in the United States. So, Dr. De Soto, more important than ever before to talk about how your commission, your work, the legal empowerment of the poor, in terms of how the poor are affected disproportionately in this recession.
Well, there's various sides to this and to the report that we brought out with Madeleine, which will become more relevant as time passes, which was essentially to continue with what Madeleine says and come to get back to your question, which is that most people in the world own things, but they don't own them legally. You remember David Lean's film on Lawrence of Arabia, Omar Sharif coming on a camel and then shooting somebody that's next to a water hole with Lawrence of Arabia, who's Peter O'Toole, and he shoots him down and says, well, why did you do that? And he said, because he was drinking my water. Everybody owns something. everywhere, in the most primitive parts of the world. But the fact of not knowing it legally leads to trouble. It leads to violence. All the wars you see basically in Africa and the Middle East, even in my part of the world, are essentially conflicts over territory. Yet Article 17 of the Declaration of Human Rights says everybody has a right to property, but it's not defined how you get it. And 4 billion people in the world don't get it, and our report is about how they should get it.
How can they get it? In a practical manner of speaking, why will oligarchs or countries, leaders, give up their rights to certain property to empower the 4 billion people who have no rights?
Well, in many ways, it's a win-win situation, because partially what has happened, and we spend a lot of time talking about a formal economy and an informal economy, and an informal economy doesn't really count in terms of what the gross national product is, and it doesn't allow a government to have access to tax money in order to build infrastructure. And the truth is that every country needs to have identified citizens, and a lot of people have no identity. That's what we found out. And so if, in fact, you create a system whereby people are part of a tax system and contribute to the growth of the economy, it is a win for the government, and for the people themselves, they then are capable of running their own lives and having control over that, what they do own and who they are. That was part of it. We found out there were people that didn't have an address. They don't have any way of identifying and being real people. So that's why we broadened Hernando's idea about property rights to also access to justice. I look at Justice Breyer there. Justice Kennedy was on our commission. He actually, I was stunned. All of a sudden I get a paper, nice parchment from the chambers of Justice Kennedy. He actually wrote out what he thought the rule of law should be, and it formed the basis of a lot of what we were doing.
How do you translate this into practical action in Peru?
Well, it's actually something we do all the time. And to address even this question, your last question, is that I think, coming from Latin America, I'm a third worlder, that the West takes for granted what property means. You're so used to it. It came into place. Your great-granddaddies did most of it throughout the 19th century. And you forget that it really underpins everything that you do. It gives, as Madeleine says, it gives you an address. I mean, when you want to identify yourself, you need your name, and the second thing you need is an address. All your credit systems are based on assets that are legally recorded, which allows you then to collateralize things. So you've got everything in the United States actually recorded and identified. Every boat, every airplane, every piece of land, every building, all your shares, all your bonds, everything is recorded. The day you forget to record something, like for example your derivatives, $600 trillion of it, then you get into trouble.
There seems to be some knowing recognition out here.
Well, yes. Well, it's important to understand. It's because you take it for granted. All of a sudden you decided that these derivatives were contracts and not property. And you decided that it didn't need to be regulated, it didn't really need to be recorded. And then after a while, you all of a sudden find out that when something goes wrong, just $1 little trillion of a subprime market, but behind that there's $600 trillion of so-called derivative paper, and you can't find who's got the bad paper, who's got the toxic waste, which bank has it, and maybe they're all insolvent. And then you have to pour in $3-4 trillion into your economy to actually lift those banks without getting to the heart of the matter, which is who's got the bad paper. So developing countries are really basically countries with bad paper. They are in a chronic recession. Nobody knows who owns what. And that's where our wars come from, and that's the reason we can't build up credit and we can't build up capital.
How do you take that leap? You're in a favela somewhere in Latin America. You own something, but it is not recorded. How does that become a legal property right? Who is willing to give you the right to that property and give you credit, give you a mortgage, give you standing in the world?
Well, the way it starts, I was listening just before, in what little time I had, in the back room there to the conference on the genome, where it said all information's out there. Well, all of a sudden, a lot of clever people realized that putting it together and seeing how one thing relates to the other really gives you the global vision of everything. So the way it begins is when somebody, for example, starts discovering a lot of oil in Alaska, and you know that there are a lot of Eskimos and Inuit that have igloos and little holes, etc., but you're not going to get your pipelines through, and you're going to have a tremendous social war if you don't identify it, that you then begin looking at their own records and their traditions, and you start recording them in a way similar to the genome, and you get the DNA of the place, and you then start the titling. Everywhere in the world that we've gone to, the places that Madeleine and I have been focusing, mainly Africa, we haven't come across one place, one tribe, that doesn't actually have a record system, but it actually is isolated from the rest. In Tanzania, for example, we've surveyed 26 districts with 950 researchers, and we didn't find one cow, one bull without a brand. The trouble is that there were a lot of anthropologists who had written hundreds of books saying that these were tribal people and they didn't have property rights because they were involved in this left versus right discussion in the United States, which obviates the fact that we all need property rights, whether we're right or left. Otherwise, fuzzy boundaries.
Hernando talked about Tanzania. We went, first of all, former President of Tanzania, Mkapa, was one of our commission members. And it was a perfect example of something. We went to a village, kind of a place, where, in fact, when it first started, the people were very concerned when the government came in and wanted to know who owned what, and they were really nervous that they were going to lose what it is they had. And the government said to them, we are doing this in order to be able to install a well and a sewer system. And so ultimately they got the people in the village to trust the government people. And when we went back there, the people said, as a result of our being able to get this titled and to get an acknowledgement that we owned it, we now have a well and a whole sewer system. But it takes some kind of a relationship to develop it. And Hernando's right about something. One of the things that did happen, this was not an easy issue, because property rights to many Americans, especially center-left, sounds like some horrible capitalist idea. The bottom line is, it is the basis of being able to be a part of an economy, and we also then started talking about labor rights and business rights and access to justice as pillars of how the 4 billion people that are outside any system can become part of their countries and the world.
Let me bring it back to home and to the way our government approaches some of these issues, some of the development challenges, because one criticism that has been voiced to me very recently and very passionately is that we have all of these agencies, the Millennium Challenge and AID and other agencies, some at state, some elsewhere, but there's nobody really rationalizing the system. We haven't even had the appointment of an AID director yet, as the administration tries to get up to speed. What, from your experience in the crazy bureaucracy that is Washington, what do we need to do to bring together all of the agencies working within the United States, and what about coordinating them with other countries that have development agencies that are not really interacting with ours?
Well, I think it is one of the more difficult aspects because there are a number of constituent groups and, as we say in Washington, stakeholders. I have been involved in various ways of looking at this ever since the Carter administration. I think that there is a real question that I always have, is whether you actually multiply the work that can be done if you have more than one agency doing it, because the Millennium Challenge account has one way of doing things, and then there's OPIC and EXIM and a number of different things. We do need better coordination. And Gail Smith, who is the person that is in the National Security Council working on this, I think they are trying to bring it together. But a lot of people have said that they had enough experience in bringing diverse groups together with Homeland Security, which is one of the weirder organizations in the U.S. government, that the bottom line is that it is important to keep these going and have them coordinate with each other. The hardest part, though, is the second part of the question, which is how you get international coordination. Because I just read I think many of you did in the New York Times today, that it is very hard now to deliver American aid to the 2 million refugees that are coming out of Pakistan, Afghanistan, because they don't want an American brand on it. And so the question is whether you can persuade Americans who don't like to give. I have banned the words foreign assistance. It's like putting two words together selling some horrible disease. You have to call it national security support. And the bottom line is that we have to be willing to give through the multilateral agencies.
It reminds me of one of the first stories I covered when I first covered the White House was the Peacemaker. The MX missile was the Peacemaker. Same difference. Dr. De Soto, what about the Made in America, as in USA America, brand when it comes to foreign assistance, national security assistance, whatever you want to call it? Is there still a stigma attached to what comes from Washington?
I think it very much depends on what you do. And also to address, in that sense, your previous question, there's always a question of leadership and enlightenment. And of course, the need to recognize it and not take it for granted. For example, I am a great admirer of General Douglas MacArthur. What did he do in terms of national security for the United States? 1942, when he knows he's going to win the war against Japan, he sets up in Honolulu a team under a man called Wolf Ludovich. And they plan what they're going to do in Japan once you win the war. 1945, Japan was a feudal empire. The gross national product of Japan, per capita of Japan, was below that of Peru, which is a reason why in Peru and Brazil we have a lot of Japanese migration. They came because they were poorer than we were in 1945. What they did was support the Japanese groups that wanted to disempower the feudal class, empower simple people, and create private property where there was traditional and customary property. What did they do? They found out that in every village, whoever were the serfs or the villains actually were recorded, not as property owners, of course, but as users of the land. They transported that into records and created the most powerful market economy in Asia. Since Japan had two colonies, Taiwan, at that time called Formosa, and then Korea, the reform spread to those three countries, done by your foreign aid system, and you put a thorn on the side of China so that 19 years after Mao Zedong took power, in came Deng Xiaoping and said, look, I don't care what color the cat has, as long as it works. And he started imitating the property rights system of these other countries. You actually started flipping Asia around 1945. I haven't read an American book that pays tribute to all of this. So you've got to become conscious of what you take for granted. You do it right once in a while. You've just got to remember.
Can that be applied to Afghanistan, where the president is now saying that he doesn't want to make a decision on additional troops until after the August election? He wants the emphasis now to be on the civil construction, reconstruction, engineering, civilian aid, which is a problem without definition.
Well, I think the hard part is how to separate this, because it's hard to do reconstruction and all the civil work without security, and it does have to go together. But I have now, I think most people who know me know that I am passionate about, I believe in democracy. I don't believe in imposing it. I do believe in supporting it. But I also know that people, democracy has to deliver. People want to vote and eat. And so what has to happen is that in order for Afghanistan to work, there does have to be this combination, a little bit of what Hernando was talking about, in terms of people buying in, literally, in terms of having a life, being able to have a job, being able to own something, and have that reconstruction go, but it has to have security around it. And the elections are an important part of it, and the institution building, but it is a huge job.
I think you're right on that question, Andrea, and just to continue what Madeleine is saying, in the case of Afghanistan, the first thing to understand is that, in effect, the legal title to the land, or that which can be enforced, belongs to landlords. And under them, you've got all of those little people which made California, Colorado. They're there, waiting. And obviously, the other thing you've got to understand, which we did when we were fighting the Shining Path in Peru, the reason we won our war in 12 years to convert them into a little minority stuck in the jungle now, is because we discovered that nobody reads Marx. It's 52 volumes, half of them in German. They still haven't even been translated to English. It's very complex. What these people do, the terrorists, what they do is essentially give security to the assets of poor people. That's what they do.
That's what the Taliban do.
That's right. So if you go in and you title, you give them the rule of law to protect them, and you don't need a terrorist anymore, and nobody likes having terrorists around. When you were hit at 9/11, for example, an atrocious thing, you were able to catch just about in 3 days all of the terrorists that had been living in the United States, because you had all the records of where they were being trained for airplanes. You had all the records of all the motels they were living in. You caught them in 3 days. The guys in the caves where there are no property rights and no addresses, you're still looking for.
Who confers titles?
Government.
And-
Sovereign power, always.
And why will governments be willing to grant title to previously untitled land?
They do all the time. In Peru, since the Spanish conquest, where we've been able to do detailed work, we have found that in average for every parcel of land there's 20 titles. They keep on giving title. The problem is it's an inflationary process. To get it right is the issue, to get it right. And to get it right means understanding that law and the building of institutions, as Madeleine is saying, is very important. And when you look at how much emphasis is given in foreign aid to the building of really good property institutions at their genesis, the way you did in the 19th century, there's very little of that going on. It's a forgotten art.
I think the hard part is the transition, because from the informal to the formal economy, and that it's a little bit like a trapeze artist of waiting for the other bar to come towards you, because the question is, once you are titled and a part of the system and you are able to get some benefits from the infrastructure as well as go out and get a loan on the land, collateralize it, and then be able to go buy fertilizer or do whatever you want, that the result is great. But until you get there, you are in this kind of limbo of being afraid that whatever you have will be confiscated, or that you actually will have to start paying taxes before you have the collateral. And it's that, I mean, that's what we talked about, is the transition part is difficult. It's a little bit, frankly, without getting into a totally different debate, on what it's like to be an illegal immigrant. I mean, if you were able then to be a part of something and be the beneficiary of it, but it's that in-between part. The other part that I learned, from Hernando, is basically there are informal parts of a formal economy and some formal parts in an informal economy. And so this transitional part, and the other part that I learned is poor people are not stupid. Poor people are as entrepreneurial as any group of people in the world, because they have to in order to make it. And I think that we have to work off of that entrepreneurial spirit that the poor people have, because they are producing things and they need to be part of the system.
What are the next steps when you take when you take your recommendations and the conclusions? You see this nexus between property rights and the growth of democracy, and protections and stakeholding, basically, for people who have been disenfranchised. How do you take it step by step, Hernando? Will a bank mortgage a piece of property which then gives that farmer collateral to buy the seed and the fertilizer and whatever else that's needed? And then will that bank be willing to foreclose on that property if it doesn't have any inherent value?
That's exactly the question. The thing is that because Westerners have forgotten to look at their own history, we've got it the other way around. You've got people trying to help developing countries get good banking. You know, the Arabs had good banking 700 years ago. You could draw a check in Damascus and cash it in Shanghai. That's the easy part. The hard part is the property. Credit comes from credibility. The word is credere in Latin. You've got credibility if you've got an address and something to lose. You don't have credibility if you don't have anything to lose. That's the first reality. Once you have got the property, you can then leverage it by, in effect, saying, I hawk my property. And then somebody will say, but you're then going to take away the assets from the poor. But if you study extra-legal markets anywhere in the world, the poor are always being dispossessed. And they're being more dispossessed where they don't have title than where they do have title, because the title at least allows them to make a deal and to risk accordingly. So, in effect, if you start giving everybody the assets or legal ownership and allow them then to use it in a variety of ways for identification, for getting credit, for getting recognition, for building up collateral, then at that moment you can start creating your credit market, as long as you're always tether that asset to the paper. When you go out and then do as you've just done in the United States, have a property, subprime or otherwise, you give it a mortgage, then you put a mortgage-backed security, then you put in a CDO, then a credit default swaps, and you go too far out on the limb and you lose track of the property because it's cut into pieces, that's when you get into trouble. As long as your paper is closely related to the guy who's going to lose it, you can't lose.
There's another part to this that we are all looking at. We have a food crisis in the world. I think yesterday it was put out that there are now 1 billion people that are hungry. And so we're talking about land, and Larry Summers was on our commission, and Hernando liked him for many reasons, but one was because he made a statement which was, nobody washes a rented car. So the bottom line is, nobody really takes care of land that they don't have, that's not theirs, that they don't have a sense of propriety about. And so the idea here is that people will be more intent on buying the fertilizer or buying the tractor and doing whatever they need to improve the land, because we have a food crisis. So I think one can argue various, really that this whole concept has a lot of legs to it.
When we talk about this concept, you made the point about Afghanistan, that security is so inextricably tied to any progress on civil society. With Shining Path marginalized, this can work in Peru, let's say. I'll grant you that. What do you do in the middle of a civil war in Darfur? What level of security do you have to have in order to begin trying to establish property rights? Is it a chicken and egg proposition?
I mean, the Darfur situation is so complicated, one can say that a lot of it began because of environmental problems, and that nobody cared, the land was not properly taken care of, there was desertification, people moved out of it. I mean, it's a complex issue. And I don't think property rights will solve everything, but failed states come out of the fact that people don't know who lives in them, what the institutions are, who owns the property, where the money comes from. And this is I think it is not the answer to everything, but it clearly is a way to begin to get some order here. And we are, if you think about this in national security terms, we have the problem of failed states, hungry people, terrorists who maraud, and I think this does offer some concepts that are helpful.
And again, how to translate concepts into action, next steps.
Well, take the case that Madeleine was talking about, which is that now you have got that most of the food in the world comes from about 1 billion, where we were seeing it in our commission, 1,600,000,000 hectares. The United States, Canada, Australia, Europe, the breadbaskets of the world. Is there more territory where we can cultivate? And the fact is there is. There's about 2,700,000,000 hectares, without including the Amazon forest, that can be cultivated between just Africa and Latin America. Now, can you title that? Well, you've got the Chinese now buying huge swaths of land all over Africa and Latin America. You've got the Unilevers and the Hersheys of the world doing it. And that works fine, because you see, the way your governments work in the West, the way I see it from the South, is that when it comes to dealing with the rich, out comes your Secretary of the Treasury, and then they say, this is good. You've got to create private ownership. But when you deal with poor people, there's all these people that translated back to your situation back in the United States. We're not there. We're in the 19th century. And they say, don't give the poor property rights. So what will end up is you'll have all of Africa and all of Latin America owned by large local and foreign corporations, and then our people and the Shining Path and Al-Qaeda will come back. You've got to find a way of bringing your left and your right together to understand that empowering poor people with what seems like a right-wing concept by giving them rights was what destroyed the feudal system and the kings of the world. Once you have gotten the people at the bottom taking care of the people at the top, then we move into the 20th century and we can look about right and left. But for the moment, it's up and down. And you've got to give the little guys a chance at it, or the big guys will take over.
The other part of this that we found useful is to do with women and inheritance laws. I mean, that is the big question that we dealt with in terms of how to make sure that women could inherit land and then work out a lot of that. The other part were with indigenous peoples. And you're looking at what's happening in certain countries in Latin America, in Peru and Bolivia and various places, so that we looked at it in ways of how you take traditional law and then also trying to move it forward in order to get more equity and equitable aspects. This is not simple. You keep rightfully asking how you get from here to there, but at least we have the here.
One little anecdote there I think that Madeleine likes very much is the one, about how do you give poor people what they've got. The fact is that the law doesn't begin with a code. The law is already there in a semiotic stage. All the signs are available. At a time, Madeleine likes a story, which was true. It was called in by the Indonesian government when I was taking holidays in Bali. And they said, how do we find out who owns what? Because we really want to do this. We want to avoid another revolution. And I told them, well, Bali is the most beautiful place in the world I've seen, probably aside from Aspen. And you keep on walking and walking and walking. But for just about every 200 yards, a different dog barks. So the Indonesian dogs know exactly where the boundaries are. The fact is that there are records, dogs barking, signs on trees. That's what you did. The United States throughout the 19th century did the most interesting revolution I've ever read. It's called 32 Preemption Acts. Gradually, against your own Supreme Court, you started recognizing that so many trees that were cut down in Colorado to make a log cabin constituted property right. 800 mining claims in California, done with 3 million Americans who came from the continent to California that didn't belong to you, belonged to Mexico. But you settled it anyhow, and then you found out where the borders were, and you decided, well, every stake, every hole, every cabin is a sign of this, and then you codified it. It's really not that difficult.
When you were just talking about different societies and different rules of law, it brought to mind one of the questions that came to us last week was many of us watching what was happening in Iran. Why were the women in the streets leading the men? If you read Roger Cohen's extraordinary reporting from Tehran in the New York Times, the women urging the men on, and as I dug deeper and talked to Shirin Ebadi and others whom you know very well, the answer came back because they had so little, they had so much at stake, so little to lose, that it requires 2 women in a court of law in Iran to testify against one man's testimony, that all of the laws since 1979 have been stacked against women. And with the lack of rights comes courage.
Well, Shirin Ebadi was on our commission, and she did a lot of explaining of exactly this kind of thing. Mary Robinson, various people that, because the law is not framed in a way to have women have equal rights of any kind. And so I do think that they learn to organize and realize that they need to work together to get it done.
Well, Madeleine Albright, Madam Secretary, and good friend to Aspen and to all of us. Hernando De Soto, thank you for your groundbreaking work, and thank you both for this conversation.